Here we go.
Good evening. Welcome to Progressive Soup. My name is David Stevenson. I'll be tonight's host.
Your kitty cat says someone is trying to call you.
Almost like we planned
He
it.
says hurry up and answer.
Almost. Hello? Yep. It's of course it's Basil, because Basil's been calling in at the beginning of every show for about a month now. And hey, did you Basil, did you put out the good word on Progressive Soup when you taped your shows for the weekend? Said yeah, he was going to do it. He did it. Because Basil did a show for Friday evening, for Good Friday, where he did just a recitation of the Good Friday story of Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior, in which Basil's mate, Lilith, tail included free of charge, who joined him in the Hereafter a couple years ago, where Lilith, who is, if you ever watch the show, Lilith is a calico cat, and when she passed away, she came back 3 days later as a calico stone, which we have as one of the props on the show, because Lilith was multicolored and Maine Coon, but came back as a calico stone with striated the four colors of black, white, gray, and brownish, and we know it's Lil because the calico stone weighs about the same amount as Lil did, just a little bit more compact. So you did it that day. Did you do it Easter Sunday also? Thanks. Said no. He took Easter Sunday off and just ran. He doesn't know exactly what he did on Easter Sunday, but he just ran some sort of. He took the day off. He said, "Okay, well, thanks. Well, make sure you do it again next time. You give us a plug. So we're plugging your show. Thanks." Oh, okay. Welcome to Progressive Soup. My name is David Stevenson. Tonight we have a return visit from Michael Zacchea, who's been on the show probably as many times as anyone else. 7 or 8 times now?
Yes, I would say, yeah.
Yeah. And quick refresher, Michael served 2 tours in Iraq. He was there at the, was it the first or second Battle of Fallujah?
Second Battle of Fallujah.
And he's also also honed his skills in Somalia during what became known as Black Hawk Down. But I'm going to let you talk a little bit about that, and then we're going to discuss your book, The Ragged Edge, which we have here noted. Go ahead, give us a little background on yourself, and then we'll move on to your book.
So thank you, Dave. Thanks for having me. And it's been, I guess, about 8 times. It's sort of like Saturday Night Live, where they have those guys when they're coming on Saturday Night Live as a guest host, and they keep track of how many times they've been on. So
you are my specialist when it comes to all military operations from on the field. Now I have another gentleman that's been on a number of times that has written some books,
really?
And he looks at the overall picture of the history of the military,
okay.
But he was never there. You were there, so
yes.
You add, I think, a little bit more, perhaps a little more in-depth perception of the...
eyewitness to history.
You were there, been there, done that.
So, my career basically mirrored the career or the history of the U.S. military with Saddam Hussein from 1991 to the present. I mean, if you include my book being published. So, very interesting though, all of this goes back to Lawrence of Arabia, and it was in April of 1917 that Lawrence began his operations against the Ottoman Turks and the Germans in the Arabian Peninsula, consolidating the Arab tribes.
100 years.
100 years ago.
Wow.
And so we're extremely cognizant of the role that Lawrence played, and I don't think it's a coincidence that we're back here talking about forming an Arab army 100 years later. So 1991 is when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and the United States basically ousted him out of Kuwait through what was then called Desert Storm, Desert Shield, but is now recognized as Gulf War I.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Legally, they basically consider Gulf War veterans anybody who has served since 1991 to the present, and they divide it into 2 categories: Gulf War I and Gulf War II. Mm-hmm. So Gulf War I is 1991 to 2001. Gulf War II is 2001 to the present. That was 1991. 1994. 1993 is when 1992 is when President Bush sent U.S. forces into Somalia, into Mogadishu. Mogadishu is a port city, and the Somali National Army General Mohammed Farah Aidid had basically done a siege of the city to prevent any of the UN food from getting out of the city into the countryland. So basically, Mohammed Farah Aidid was using hunger or famine as a weapon. He had weaponized famine. So the Marines broke the siege, basically, at that. And then, but what we know now, which we did not know then, is so U.S. forces, the mission changed from breaking the siege and getting food out to the countryside to capturing Mohammed Farah Aidid. And what we know now is that, so obviously the U.S. was using helicopters, gained air superiority, and the so-called Battle of Mogadishu, that one fateful 24-hour period when a bunch of Americans, I think it was 17 Americans, were killed, a bunch of helicopters were shot down. The Somali National Army had adopted tactics from the Afghans, from Osama bin Laden, to mass RPGs in a built-up area to deny air superiority to U.S. forces. And they got that from the Afghans fighting against the Russians in the 1980s.
And the Afghans did a pretty successful job against the Russians.
Yes, they did. And so we now know how what was then, Al-Qaeda was involved in that. So, and it's no coincidence that that happened at the end of October of 1993. The first World Trade Center bombing was December 11th of 1993. Osama bin Laden's goal has always been to get the United States off of the Saudi Arabian Peninsula, which he considered a
holy area.
Right, and that we were basically, our presence there was profane. And so he wanted to prove that the United States would not fight and would back away from a fight. So they understood the Black Hawk Down battle as a great victory for Al-Qaeda, because basically that is what precipitated the event where U.S. forces pulled out of Somalia, which we did. And I was there January through March of '94, covering the withdrawal of U.S. forces from Somalia. And then, 10 years later, I got orders to go to Iraq to build and train and lead in combat the first Iraqi army battalion trained by U.S. military. And really, I was the first American to train to build an Arab army, and the first Westerner to do this since Lawrence of Arabia.
Now, one of our guests in the audience keeps going like this, and I realize it's been a few shows now since you explained to the audience why you wear the dark glasses.
Right. So we have the studio lights here. I got blown up in Iraq. I was blown up by a rocket propelled grenade, and I have a traumatic brain injury and light sensitivity. So the lights here are too bright for me. They hurt my eyes. So these are prescription glasses from the VA.
Okay, continue with talking about the Army.
Sure. So the title of the book is called The Ragged Edge, and that is based on a speech that our commanding general, Paul Eaton, gave to us in April of 2004 in the Green Zone. And in it he said, gentlemen, we are at the ragged edge of our competence, and there's no assurance of our success. And that was a very dramatic moment, because just a week before, or 2 weeks before, the American contractors had been abducted and murdered in Fallujah. That was that whole business where the 4 guys are going through the city on their own, and they get abducted, and they're brutally murdered, and they're hung from the bridge in Fallujah. And so that is what precipitated the first Battle of Fallujah. And for the first Battle of Fallujah, the first Iraqi army forces that were trained by a private military corporation were supposed to be going to Fallujah, but they got attacked and they basically disbanded on first contact with the enemy.
Now, these are the folks that were being paid, our combat troops are paid a fairly small amount of money for what they go
Right.
through. These are the, for lack of a better term, they were mercenaries being paid a substantial amount of money
Right.
for doing much less than our troops
Right.
do.
The going rate was $1,000 a day for a contractor, and that's tax-free. So the way the law is written, you can do the first $90,000 that you earn in a combat theater are tax-free. So basically, the game was these guys would come into country, they'd earn $1,000 a day tax-free. They'd rotate out of country for like a month, and then they come back in and start the clock all over again.
So they could certainly make $200,000-300,000 in a year. And what purpose did they serve? What was the reason for having them in Iraq?
Oh, well,
instead of our
this
troops?
is a very, very little-known story. So Donald Rumsfeld, who was the Secretary of Defense at the time, had this idea about what he called a revolution in military affairs. And basically, what he and the Bush administration wanted to do is outsource the military function to private military corporations.
I know that all the food preparation and the food distribution in Iraq were not soldiers.
Right. That's correct.
They were
it was all KBR.
contract work. Kellogg Brown Root. Yeah.
Right. Which was Vice President Cheney's
Company. Yeah.
company.
Yeah.
And they had no bid contract. So, but lots of these other contractors popped up, like Triple Canopy and Custer Battles and what was then called Blackwater, and all these other people popped up. And it's interesting how the
Custer. What was the one with Custer in it?
Custer Battles. It's another. That's what the movie War Dogs is based on. Is these two guys who just started to, bid on contracts, and they had no basis for it, and they just sort of were freelancing and doing their own thing, and they made like $1 billion.
It's an odd name to draw from, because Custer wasn't really that successful, was he?
No, he was not. But these guys are just adventurers who.
Like they could have taken Edsel instead.
Yeah,
for all the vehicles being used in Iraq, and kept them from the Edsel company.
Yeah. Very little known. At the height of the Iraq War, when we had about 150,000 American troops on the ground, there were more than 180,000 contractors on the ground. So this is a political ploy that politicians come up with in order to minimize. At least publicly, they can say that we only have 150,000 troops there, when in reality we had much more.
330 active people.
Right, and one of the things that has changed significantly is that these contractors are now conducting both tactical and security operations on the battlefield without any accountability to the American military ground commander. The Department of Defense claims to not have known how many American contractors there were in theater, and not just American, but other countries too. There were a number of, there were Nepalese, there were Macedonians, there were Lebanese security companies. There's all kinds of South Africans all over the place, Russians.
Were they free from following the rules of engagement? Could they do whatever basically they wanted to do, including torture?
This is tricky, and they want to have it both ways. So on the one hand, they want to say, yes, that they're not subject to the rules of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. But on the other hand, when they're sued, for instance, there's a class action lawsuit against KBR, and there's been a number of other suits against KBR. They say, well, we're acting under the jurisdiction of the U.S. military, so we cannot be sued. So you can't have both ways, but that's what they're trying to do in court. And that touches on, and here's why. The so-called burn pit syndrome happened because of a contract that KBR had to incinerate all this garbage in Iraq and Afghanistan. And the contract called for them to use closed air incinerators. And they did not. They just had these massive landfills, and they would just burn everything in it, including radioactive material, including body parts, including all kinds of toxic waste, including all kinds of stuff. And so now millions of Americans are going to get sick because of their exposure to these, including chemicals, to these toxic burn pits.
I have a friend, Melissa, that the same way she was exposed to washing off equipment that had radioactive dust on it,
Right.
and where you or I would get a cold, she gets pneumonia now because of that. So there's a lot of, no pun intended, fallout from the actions of what we did there.
This is the ticking time bomb in the generation of post 9/11 veterans, and this is all going to come out. But here's why the U.S. military, or why politicians are using these contractors today, is because it removes the risk, it removes the onus for the U.S. military and for Department of Veterans Affairs to care for these contractors for any injuries or sicknesses incurred while under contract. Basically it's a long-term cost-saving thing. And of course, it didn't work because this is the most expensive war in history. It's more than $5 trillion and climbing every day. But basically that was the idea, is that Donald Rumsfeld would outsource these military functions in order to reduce the exposure, the liability, and the footprint of the U.S. military. What he really thought of would be that the military became brokers of military services in theater. And this is, I think, where this idea to repurpose the Iraqi army came from. President Bush and others famously said, "As they stand up, we will stand down."
I remember that.
So,
Yep.
Basically the idea was, we'll let the Iraqis fill in and do the fighting for the Americans. And instead of, so Bremer in May of 2003 disbanded the Iraqi army.
Yeah.
And they never actually surrendered. They never came to the table and offered a formal surrender. And we were fascinated by this. We asked them, what happened to you when Americans came in and rolled into Baghdad, et cetera? And all the Iraqis said, well, we were just told to go home and wait for their orders. So in May of 2013, Bremer basically, May of 2003, Bremer basically formalized this and just disbanded the Iraqi army by decree. They, in their minds, were never defeated. So a year later, and then in June of 2003 is when the insurgency really started. Abu Musab al-Zarqawi blew up the first, the UN mission in Baghdad, and the UN basically pulled out after that. So a year later, or 6 months later, the first Iraqi army troops that were trained by this private military corporation fell apart. And so we were already in theater, but we were tasked with rebuilding the Iraqi army and training it and leading it in combat. But this idea, I think what they want to do, they wanted the new Iraqi army to be allies in the so-called global war on terror. And they had this vision that they would have a Jeffersonian democracy in the Middle East, and it would spread out from the Middle East to the rest of, or spread
Just
out.
just like a rose bush, dropping its rose petals at the feet of those coming into Baghdad.
Right.
The claim that they expounded on at length.
Rather than using there's a UN program called D2R2, which is disarmament, demobilization, rehabilitation, and reintegration for defeated armies. They chose not to, and they wanted to repurpose the Iraqi army, or the remnants of the Iraqi army.
What had been the problem in just keeping the army in place?
Well, they disappeared.
And say, hey, look, your leader's gone. Come on back out and do your job again.
Because it was a corrupt organization. It was a Ba'ath organization.
Ba'athist party, yep.
And they were already, the Iraqi army was already guilty in total of numerous crimes against humanity and war crimes.
Were they looked down upon by the citizens of Iraq?
The citizens of Iraq hated them.
Okay.
Now, that's one of the things that we did. Our first Iraqi army battalion conducted a number of civil operations and that had never been done by the Iraqi army at all. And we were really conscious of trying to win the hearts and minds of the Iraqi population. And this is really important because the insurgents were trying to intimidate the Iraqi citizenry by fear, and we wanted them on our side. So that's what insurgency is, or counterinsurgency is winning the hearts and minds of a population. Long story short, but that's basically what happened. Now, in 2004, in June of 2004, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who had formed the original organization that he had in Iraq, was called the Islamic State of Iraq. And he was in correspondence with Osama bin Laden, and he pledged loyalty to Osama bin Laden. And in return, Osama bin Laden made him an emir of Al-Qaeda, and that's when it became Al-Qaeda in Iraq. But Zarqawi wrote to him that we have to destroy this Iraqi army before it takes root, because otherwise democracy will surely follow and we will lose. And he was talking specifically about my battalion when he did that, or when he said that.
So it was targeting you,
right?
We were Italian.
Right. We were suffering all of the, or enduring all of the atrocities that you associate with ISIS on a daily basis. We had a number of our Iraqi soldiers were abducted and beheaded, a number were abducted and tortured, their families were victimized, all kinds of things. So it was really, what I was trying to do is hold the battalion together while we were in combat against Zarqawi.
So it was very much a win or lose situation for them. They recognized that they had better put the pedal to the metal and win while they had time, or else they all might be lost, and we as America and the Iraqi government might be successful long term.
I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say that they were necessarily motivated by either winning or losing. I would say that they were, most of the Iraqis were motivated by earning money for their family. There was a commitment to what they called Wahed Iraq, which means one Iraq. They did not want the country dismembered into three parts, into Shia, Sunni, and Kurdish parts,
which the British had created back around the time of Lawrence of Arabia.
Yes, in the wake of World War I. That was the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And Lawrence of Arabia was profoundly betrayed by his promises to the Arabs, and he was very disillusioned, which is something that happens to advisors oftentimes. So similarly, in 2014, when ISIS invaded and took over Fallujah and Ramadi, and the Iraqi army basically ran away in the face of ISIS, in the face of an inferior ISIS force, we advisors were extremely disillusioned by the fruits of our, or the bitter fruits of our labor.
So you felt like there was a pretty strong chance that it all might fall apart.
Yes, absolutely. And my Iraqi army battalion had already been disbanded. It had been disbanded basically in 2011 with when the U.S. forces left Iraq. My Iraqi battalion, in some regards, it mirrored the arc of the U.S. involvement in Iraq from the beginning to the withdrawal of U.S. forces. Our battalion was involved in, it was the only Iraqi army unit that was involved in the operation that killed Abu Musab al-Zarqawi.
Was your unit all Sunni, all Shia, or a combination?
No. So originally, it was, when we started the Iraqi army, it was supposed to be a third Sunni, a third Shia, and a third Kurd.
So all three regions were represented.
And we had also representation of smaller religious and ethnic minorities, including Assyrians and Chaldeans and Turkmen and Yazidis and people like that. But over time, and it was not apparent to me, but when Ted and I were writing the book, it became apparent that the battalion commander we got, who was a Shia, was systematically sidelining the Sunnis and the Kurds and turning it into an all-Shia battalion, which is basically...
That's a recipe for disaster.
And it was. Now, interestingly enough, I just heard an interview on CNN with the Iraqi officer who is our battalion commander. He is now a major general and the commanding general of the Western Baghdad district for defending Baghdad. He is a son of the sheikh of the Al Harbiya tribe, which is a Shi'a tribe based in southern Iraq. So very interesting how things work out. But in the writing process that Ted and I had, as we pulled all these disparate things together. So when I was in it, I couldn't see these things happening. But when I take a step back and I looked at the whole history, I could see what was going on. And it illuminated a lot of things for me that were otherwise a mystery.
Well, you're working with people that you have a bit of a communications gap. I mean, you've got people that are translating, but still, things get lost in translation, and so it's hard to know exactly what's.
I was extremely aware that, and we had very good. We got very lucky with interpreters. We got our interpreters off the streets at the very beginning. We did not have.
They didn't search them out?
No. We hired them off the streets, and we just got what we got, and we were very, very lucky. We had some Kurds, we had some Arabs, and they turned out to be extremely loyal to us. They themselves suffered. One of my Iraqi interpreters was subsequently assassinated shortly after I left. Some of their families were brutalized and they were threatened. But we, miraculously, we got interpreters who were both very good and very loyal to what we were doing, and it was very, very.
Have any of the? Well, we're going to save this for the next show because we're going to come back and do a second show tomorrow at noon 30. But did two questions? Have any of those families of those interpreters you had, or any of the folks that worked with you, have any of them or their families actually been allowed to come for protection, come to America?
Yeah.
And the second question we're saving for the second show is about the United Nations in general. Okay. Whether, we have a Security Council of five countries and 180 or so members, 200 members, a lot of members. Is there some threshold that we should allow to override the veto of one country? We're going to come back and talk about that tomorrow. That's something to chew on till then. So come back and join us tomorrow at noon 30. David Stevenson, Michael Zacchea.
Thanks, Dave.
Progressive Soup. We'll see you tomorrow at noon 30.